for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of 81 All Out Podcast. This is Mahesh, your host for this episode. Today we're going to be talking about all-rounders in Test cricket. It's a no-brainer why we're talking about it in the current context, because Ben Stokes, with his compelling performances with both bat and ball over the last few months, has evoked comparisons with some of the legends of the game, and rightfully so. We thought we'll use this context to dig a little deeper about the role of all-rounders in Test cricket, to make sense of them, to figure out how to evaluate them, to talk about pitfalls of typical narratives around all-rounders. I'm quite excited to talk about this with two special guests today, the founders of CricVestigate, Investigate in Cricket. It's a new initiative by two very passionate fans, one from Melbourne and one from London. You can follow them on Twitter. Their handle is @CricVestigate. I'll link the Twitter handle in the show notes as well. So let me introduce them now. Rav from Melbourne, an engineering professional, but more keen about cricket. Hi, Rav. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Mahesh. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Cheers. And Arj, a finance professional from London. In the times of Brexit, naturally more keen on cricket at the moment. Hi, Arj. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Mahesh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for joining us, guys. I know your handle has been quite busy tweeting a lot of very, very interesting numbers on all-rounders in cricket over the years. And particularly the Ben Stokes phenomenon has triggered a lot more conversation around it, which is very good for us. Just to set the stage on this, I know all-rounders come in very many shapes and forms in cricket. Personally, how do you look at an all-rounder? How do you define an all-rounder? Is that someone who can be picked generally as a batsman or a bowler in a team, because that's going to restrict a lot of people? Just to get a sense, yeah.
So historically, people have taken given the description that you've just given, where you can play in the side as either a batsman or a bowler. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a far too strict a definition, because in history you won't find many people who can do that. For me, an all-rounder is someone who, in their weaker discipline, it's almost too good to be. If your weaker discipline is as a batsman, you're far too good to be a tail-ender. You're regularly contributing. For example, someone like a Richard Hadley, as a bowling all-rounder, his batting wouldn't be good enough to bat in the top six, but his contributions are just too consistent to be not regarded as an all-rounder. Whereas someone like a Wasim Akram or a Mitchell Johnson is probably in that region where they're not quite all-rounders. And if you take the flip side, a batting all-rounder, someone like a Jacques Kallis, again, he didn't take that many wickets per test. He took less than 2 wickets per test, but he consistently bowled for South Africa and ended up with 296 wickets, a reasonable average. And he's certainly more than a part-timer. And again, in that sort of region between part-timers and for batting all-rounders, in the region between part-timers and full-time all-rounders, you've got people like Wally Hammond, Frank Worrell, more recently Sanath Jayasuriya in test matches. Those kind of players, they were useful bowlers. They could take you, maybe a wicket per test, but not good enough to be full-time all-rounders. So for me, the contribution on the weaker discipline is too high to be ignored and too consistent to be ignored. That's how I kind of define all-rounder.
And I agree with that 100%. And one other thing to remember is some of the greatest all-rounders managed to excel in both batting and bowling for a series or over a few seasons. It's like they're a top-tier bowler and top-tier batsman. But they couldn't really do that over an entire career. It's impossible to do that. And it may be possible for them to maintain the averages, but the contribution and the workload of two full-time specialists, that's impossible to manage over a career. So I agree that, like I've said, the secondary skills too good to be ignored. So that's pretty much the definition of all-rounder. I would say the primary skills good enough to be as one of the top 6 batsmen or frontline top 4 bowlers, and the secondary skills right up there as a very, very useful contribution.
Great. Thanks a lot for that. I think that sets the stage for our discussion going forward, because if you restrict it to genuine all-rounders, then we are going to be talking about 4 or 5 people, and that's about it. So I'll probably take on from there to get your sense on how do you assess all-rounders. Both of you have been extremely busy crunching a lot of numbers in the recent days. So I'm really keen to hear some of your favorite metrics, and of course, each metric has its own pitfall as well. If you can elaborate on them.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the common metrics that we see on any kind of analysis is people take the very simplistic approach of taking a batting average minus a bowling average, looking at who's got the highest when you do that difference. From my perspective, that measure is useful, but it's far too biased towards batting all-rounders. Because if you think about it, let's take a batsman who averages 50, and let's say we equate a batsman who averages 50 with a bowler who averages 25. If that batsman who averages 50 improved his average to 55, it would be equivalent to the bowler, a 25 averaging bowler, improving his average to say 23. It wouldn't be the same as going from 25 to 20. So because of the difference in the scales of the averages, I don't think you can simply do one batting average, take batting average and subtract bowling average. And some people look at the approach of taking a batting average and dividing the bowling average. Again, I'm not a huge fan of that, because again, it's biased towards batting all-rounders. You could have a guy who averages 50 with the bat, 40 with the ball, and he's equivalent to a guy who averages 40 with the bat and 32 with the ball. But a guy who's a batting all-rounder averaging 40 with the ball probably wouldn't be good enough to be classified as an all-rounder. So for me, the metrics which you need to look at is you need to take into account the batting and bowling averages. But I also think you need to bring into that equation contribution. So wickets per match are very crucial if you're a bowler. For example, a player like Hansi Cronje is a good example. His bowling average is fantastic. It's 29. But he only took 43 wickets, less than a wicket per test, much less. So you can't just look at the average. You've got to bake in a contribution with bat and ball, so runs per test and wickets per test. And if you combine that with the averages, I think at CricVestigate we've come up with a metric to sort of assess all-rounders. I'll pass on to Ram and let him talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Aj. Yeah, so basically, like Aj said, averages are important. It reflects the individual brilliance. But you've got to look at the match contribution, because at the end of the day, it's a team game. So how many runs per test and how many wickets per test are just as important as averages. And if I could touch on one really good example is if you look at the batting averages of Ian Botham and Sean Pollard, there's hardly any difference. It's 33.5 and 32.3. But if you look at the number of runs they made per test match, Ian Botham made 51 runs per test and Pollock made 35 runs per test. So Botham's 16 extra runs is a much bigger contribution to the team. So I guess you cannot ignore the individual brilliance. So we have to take averages into account. So when we developed the index, so we looked at 3 things, 2 primary things and 1 secondary thing. The 2 primary things were, for instance, for batting index, it takes into account the batting average and it takes into account the runs per test. And also added a secondary contributor for impact, which looks into number of hundreds scored per innings, but also added an element of average batting position, because if you look at it, like average batting position for Jack Cullis is 3.9, so top 4 pretty much. For someone like Hadley, it's 7.8 or something, so it's 8. So we made some adjustments for that. So that's how we developed our batting index. Similarly, for the bowling index, again, there was a secondary impact factor, which takes into account the 4-wicket, 5-wicket hauls, and also considers the bowling position. But the 2 primary factors, once again, is the bowling average and the wickets per test. So, and then we combined those 2 methods and created an index. And we picked about 10 players. I mean, we looked at about 50 to 60 players, but to talk about it in a little bit more depth, we picked about 10 players. I'll quickly mention the names in the order they played. Keith Miller, Gary Sobers, Imran Khan, Tony Greig, Richard Hadley, Ian Botham, Kapil Dev, Sean Pollock, Jack Callis, and for the modern fans, we picked Ben Stokes over Shakib, just to keep it all like sort of pace bowling all-rounders. All the Sobers bowled both. And a very good all-rounder would have that index value of about 7.5 plus. And really, really top-class all-rounders would have an index close to 10. Pretty much most of them fall around that 10 mark. And there were 2 or 3 exceptional all-rounders who went reasonably above 10. That would be Imran Khan, 11, and Gary Sobers, 12. And it sort of makes sense. No matter what you do, no matter what sort of scaling you use, those two almost pretty much end up being the top 2 in all sort of metrics. And you've got to keep in mind, this index looks at just the overall career. So just like the averages, it corresponds to the overall career. But if you want to look further against each opposition away in difficult other countries, then you've got to just use the same equations to come up with the index. So for Gary Sobers, the index would be higher against England, but would be a lot lower against New Zealand. So,
I think the more we dig into, the more we'll eventually end up with a Sena kind of bucket for all-rounder index. And we certainly are not going to go there. But quite interesting and quite revealing as well. And I'm very glad that in fact, we addressed these pretty much straight away, because one of the most irritating screenshots that I've seen in all of cricket pretty much is when Callis, I think, was about to retire, and there was this, his batting record and bowling record were superimposed over, Sachin's and Zahir Khan's as batsman and bowler. And this ridiculous comparison was going around everywhere, which is quite irritating because, like ours mentioned, Callis probably takes less than 2 wickets per match. And there is no way in comparison to what Zach did. One, in terms of the wickets per match, and 2, in terms of the amount of overs that he bowled, especially as the frontline new ball bowler. This nuance is absolutely lost when you take a stat like that and kind of mainstream it and dumb it down, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this in the first place.
I'll just quickly add something to that since you mentioned the workload part. You're right. We didn't include that as part of the index because the contribution already takes workload into account. But I still put together some numbers. And if you look at the balls faced, batted, and the number of balls delivered, nobody comes anywhere near Gary Sobers. He played 400 deliveries per test matches, as in bowled or batted. And I think the next best is Richard Hadley, 318. So it's like 20% ahead. And the most revealing thing, or the thing that still amazes me, although I've known this for a long time, is that every time I look at balls delivered per test match, Richard Hadley obviously has the highest number. You won't believe this. Gary Sobers is number 2. He's delivered more deliveries than Kapil Dev, Imran Khan. I know Gary Sobers bowled both spin and pace, but still he bowled more deliveries than Imran Khan or Kapil Dev or even Sean Pollock per test match. It's unreal. And the 2 lowest in terms of balls delivered were actually Callis and Ben Stokes. Callis bowled pretty much half of what Sobers bowled per test match, and Ben Stokes is not that much higher than Callis.
Very interesting. Just a related question. I know you might have the number on this as well. What was the average bowling position for Sobers? Do you have the number on that?
Yes. So average bowling position. So we calculated this by just multiplying it and dividing the sums. Average bowling position for Sobers was 3.5. So
he was comfortably a fourth bowler. He was. And in a lot of occasions, he even opened the bowling. We know that. But he was comfortably the fourth bowler.
It is surprising to me There is an anecdote. I was thinking of sharing it later, but I'll just quickly mention that when Tom Gravney, very good English batsman, was interviewed by I can't remember who it was. He was asked that who would he pick to bat for his life, and then he just mentioned Sobers. Too much to the surprise of the interviewer because he expected Hutton to be the answer. And then he just added this one funny little anecdote saying that most of the English top order batsmen actually wanted Sobers to make some runs because they didn't want him to take the new ball because he had this lethal swing. So that, troubled Jeffrey Boycott, Kenny Barrington, they were the most common victims of Sobers. And I am surprised when I found out it was 3.5, but I guess it also made sense because he made a lot of runs, which meant he probably bowled as number 3 or 4 for his team, I would imagine.
I mean, it's hard to find exact stats on this, but from what I've looked into, it's clear that Sobers' spin bowling actually is what affected his stats a bit. I mean, I think as a pace bowler, he's certainly better than a 34 average, but it's hard to get stats of when he bowled spin and when he bowled pace.
Yeah, that's true. And the other thing is that oftentimes, if he bowled spin, I can go into match examples, but I will stay away from it. 1966 Leeds Test, I think I recently posted about it, is that when there was nothing happening with the pace bowling or swing, and the batsman settled in, the other bowlers, Westall or Griffith, who were bowling at the time, didn't get wickets. That's when Sobers turns to spin. So oftentimes, if he has to bowl spin, which meant the batsmen are set and there weren't much happening. So I strongly believe the stats for his pace bowling would be a lot superior to his spin bowling. I'm fairly confident, but it's very hard to verify that.
So essentially, Sobers, the fast bowler, was the strike bowler, and Sobers, the spinner, was the one who made things happen, is it?
That's
I think given his strike
words on Twitter.
I think given Sobers' strike rate, I'm not sure he made a lot of happen with the spin. He was more of a container, I think. But I think the point about the people who truly qualify as batting all-rounders, one fact that's important is that, with Kallis as well, is that they didn't get to bowl in the favourable conditions. They would often have to do the work when the ball was a bit older, like Stokes is doing at the moment. So that has to be taken into account. But I totally agree, Mahesh. I mean, you can't make a comparison between Zahir Khan and Kallis as a bowler. It's crazy. That's not to knock Kallis. Kallis is a fantastic player. The fact that a batsman of that quality is offering that with the ball is just an amazing achievement. But people shouldn't sort of misinform by equating his bowling to the effectiveness of a strike bowler like Zahir Khan.
Yes, and since Rav has talked a lot about Sobers, and it's a question that I wanted to ask him even during the middle of a lot of his Twitter threads, but this is probably a good context for us to talk about it as a theoretical framework as well. It's one of my sort of firm beliefs that a bowling all-rounder is a lot easier to fit into in the team game compared to a batting all-rounder. And the logic is fairly simple. Like all of us know that a bowling all-rounder will definitely bat, and he doesn't have to disrupt the batting lineup for him to utilize his skills. Whereas a batting all-rounder, for his bowling skills to be to make an impact, it has to come in the way of the captain using the 4 mainstream bowlers in the first place. Sobers is of course an exception, but if you look at someone like Kallis or even Stokes, you are effectively the 5th bowler. And in the current match, in fact, as we speak, we are talking in the middle of the first test between Pakistan and England. Stokes is even the 6th bowler. Do you see fundamentally that a bowling all-rounder is more valuable to a team, or we are just making too much of some exceptions?
No, I think, Mahesh, what you say is generally correct. I personally prefer bowling all-rounders. But I think the fact that our definition of all-rounders has already set quite a high threshold. So there aren't that many batting all-rounders. The ones that we've given that role, such as Stokes, Tony Greig, Kallis, Sobers, have already met a criteria in their bowling that they're bowling regularly. And just on Kallis again, his bowling was incredibly valuable to South Africa because you have to remember that South Africa, in their history, after Huey Tayfield, they haven't had a regular spinner. Paul Adams was effective for a short time, but in general, their spin bowling option hasn't been effective. So they've had to, they've had excellent opening bowlers. They've had Donald, Pollock, Steyn, Morkel, Philander, those kind of guys. But Kallis has often had to bowl very important spells when the balls got older. And without the spinner to hold up the end, that fifth bowler has been invaluable for South Africa. So I would say your general point about bowling all-rounders, I'll agree with. But given the threshold that we've set, a strict threshold, I would say I couldn't necessarily say one was more valuable than the other. It would depend on the balance of the side. I mean, as you said, for England, the fact that Ben Stokes is a batting all-rounder is far more beneficial than if he was a bowling all-rounder, because the English team's bowling is far stronger than their batting. The opposite is true of Kapil Dev, for example. Kapil Dev, at the time he was bowling, he was India's best bowler. Indian bowling was a lot weaker than the Indian batting. So they needed Kapil Dev as a bowling all-rounder. If he was an equivalent quality batting all-rounder, he probably wouldn't have the same impact on Indian cricket. So it depends on the team balance. But I think your point also holds true for people who don't quite make the all-rounder threshold. So if you've got, I'd rather have a bowler who could bat a bit like a Wasim Akram than have a batsman who could just turn his arm over. So yeah, that would be my...
That is my point. Of course, when you get into the elite list, the standards are so high, the difference is not too much, let's say, between a Sobers and an Imran. But let's just get out of this elite zone and talk more about how cricket is played and how a team gets its balance. Let's say, for instance, India tried to play Stuart Binney for a while as someone who could bat number 6 and also bowl a few overs in Test cricket, right? They did that in England. They've tried Hardik Pandya, for instance. So now these are fairly problematic sort of choices from a team balance perspective. But you take, let's say, even if you play Jadeja and Ashwin away, they'll end a lot more balance because their primary skill bowling is always going to be fully utilized. And the batting will also be utilized because they are batting in their natural place. But for you to bowl Hardik or a Stuart Binney, you are necessarily taking overs out of the mainstream frontline bowlers.
You could talk a lot more about this, but I just want to add one thing. With the index that we created, Jadeja and Ashwin scored pretty highly, by the way. It's because of their number of wickets per test match. And they're pretty useful batsmen as well. So just wanted to mention that they are just above 10 in our index. So that places them in, as far as the overall stats are concerned, among elite all-rounders ever to play the game. But anyway, I'll let Arch talk about Hardik Pandya and stuff.
So I think, very interesting points, Mahesh. But what I would say is certainly in Indian conditions, playing Jadeja and Ashwin together is very, very valuable because you can play a 5-man attack because both of them are capable batsmen. The problem is when you go away from home, in English conditions, you'd rather play, if you have a 5-man attack, you'll rather have 4 seamers usually. I mean, in this match against England, Pakistan have picked, obviously, 2 spinners. But generally, you could see why India wanted to play Hardik Pandya. And actually, Hardik Pandya, when he played, wasn't completely out of his depth. I mean, he got 5 wickets at Trent Bridge, if I remember rightly. And he got he played some useful innings as well. But I agree with you, Mahesh. I think the problem with Hardik Pandya is even though on paper his stats were okay, 30 kind of average with the bat, 30 with the ball, you could, as an overall player, he probably can make the side. But he just didn't quite fit into the balance because he's not quite good enough to bat top 6 and he's not quite good enough to be in your main 3 seamers. So he kind of threw the balance off the side.
Yeah, so that's a larger point I was making, that if you're not in that elite sort of level, a bowling all-rounder lends himself naturally to the team balance versus batting all-rounder. That's just a minor point that I was making because I am a bowling all-rounder, so I'm just batting off twice. Sort of a logical... Sorry, go ahead, Arj.
I would agree with you. But I think it also, the problem with Indian cricket specifically, even if Hardik Pandya was a better bowler than he is, he still wouldn't be as good as Jasprit Bumrah, Mohammad Shami, or Ishan Sharma in current form. So he's never really going to get into that side as a bowler. And if you want the spinner, he's not going to be part of the four-man attack. So for him to get into the side, he really needs to be a top six batsman. So I guess maybe we're kind of agreeing with each other in a roundabout way.
But at the same time, you have a lot of quality, batsmen in the wings for India as well. So that might be difficult to.
He won't. He won't make it because someone like Hanuman Vihari's first class record, and even what he's done so far in his Test match career has been reasonable.
Yeah, it's a bit like all the batsmen Australia had and all the fast bowlers West Indies had. You just sometimes a team having too big a squad, very good bench strength could impact people like Hardik Pandya.
An interesting point, Mahesh, I wanted to make was that this may be stretching it, but an equivalent type of player to Hardik Pandya, although he's slightly different, would be someone like a Moeen Ali. Moeen Ali actually, if you look at his raw numbers, they aren't particularly impressive. You've got something like a 28 batting average, 36 bowling average. But the key point was that he was a spinner. And after Graham Swan retired, England didn't really have any good quality spinners. And even now, the jury's still out. So even though Moeen Ali, his individual disciplines probably wasn't quite there, because he added something to the balance of the side, he could get in. Whereas someone like a Hardik Pandya didn't really, as we discussed, sort of imbalance the side.
Okay, so moving on, in terms of all-rounders, I know you guys have talked about your index as well, and I'm sure this problem comes through in your index as well. On how do you distinguish between, or let me put it this way: is there a very clear demarcation point between calling someone a greater cricketer but a lesser all-rounder? Let's say, for instance, someone like Ashwin averages more than 5 wickets a match. Richard Hadlee averages 5 wickets a match. Now, you could have another all-rounder with better secondary skill than Hadlee, but overall, there are clearly pockets where someone can be a much greater cricketer, although he's a lesser all-rounder. Did that come through in your indices as well?
We did a scaling so that both the batting and bowling were equally weighed in. Because he added a lot of moderation to things, it didn't really favor one or the other. It's quite balanced. Without sounding big-headed, I think we've added a lot of moderation to make sure that Hadley's extreme number of wickets per test or Sobers' extreme number of runs per test. Despite batting at number 6, he scored more runs than Kallis per test. So we moderated it, so it didn't really pick up on that. And we wanted to make sure that the index is about all-rounders, and like Aj said, the secondary skill has to be a higher threshold than, some people are useful at something. So for instance, if we use the same index for some of the batsmen and bowlers, it wouldn't quite work well because they don't meet the minimum threshold. Like, for instance, if I use Tendulkar's numbers on this index, it will be significantly lower than Kapil Dev because of the wickets per test and all those contribution from both part. But moving away from the index, do you want to add something, Raj?
No, I think it's a very interesting question, Mahesh, one that I've thought about for a lot. Usually, a lot of the top all-rounders, like we mentioned, the Sobers, the Imran, even a Jacques Kallis, or a Hadlee, someone like that, their primary skill is of an all-time great level. So it's quite easy to compare them because you think, for example, with the Sobers, his batting alone is already, in my opinion, I agree with Ravi, I think he's probably the second best ever. So it's quite easy to rate him above other batsmen or even without considering the bowling. And with someone like an Imran Khan, if you were to compare, or even a Richard Hadlee, you take a Richard Hadlee, say, and one of the great fast bowlers, a Dennis Lilly. To me, it's pretty obvious that on bowling, it's close. I'd probably favour Hadlee slightly, but overall, with Hadley's batting, he's clearly better. Where it becomes more interesting as a player, as an overall player, where it becomes more interesting is how do you compare a player who wasn't an all-time great in either of his disciplines, he was very good in them, very good in one and useful in the other, versus an all-time great in one discipline. Then it becomes tricky. So, for example, Mahesh, I'll throw the question to you. In India, who would you say is rated as a better, more valuable test player? Sunil Gavaskar or Kapil Dev?
More valuable test player, I would think most people will side with Sunny. But of course, if you extend it to other formats and overall, Kapil kind of, comes over. And the reason being that Kapil's record as a bowler, while great by Indian standards, phenomenal, in fact, by Indian standards, is perhaps a little less so compared to other great bowlers around the world. For good reason as well, because he bowled in conditions which are harder and stuff like that. But even when he bowled in conditions which are more favorable, it's probably not in the elite, so to say, not in the cream of cream. Whereas Sunny makes it to the cream of cream on all parameters as a batsman. So
I don't think Kapil did that well in England with the ball, but so I agree with you. But I think still, if you think about it, you've got an all-time great batsman in Gavaskar. You've got a very fine bowler in Kapil Dev. So if you just compare those two, of course, Gavaskar wins. But if you then add Kapil Dev's batting into that, can he not catch up? I mean, that's why it's a tricky question, which I don't have the answer to.
No, which is precisely the reason why I threw the question to you guys. I find it extremely problematic. But I'm fairly comfortable in picking Sunny overall because the problem with all-rounders is that the padding of stats, you add up two things, like the one that I mentioned earlier about Callis being equated to Sachin plus Zahir. That applies pretty much throughout. Like you take someone like Stokes, right? You add a 43 batting average to a sub, I don't know what is his overall average. Let's say sub 30 bowling average. It feels like you've got like more than 1.5 cricketers. But at the end of the day, Malcolm Marshall is certainly superior. There's no doubt about it. But if you go down to someone lesser than Malcolm Marshall, even let's say Jimmy Anderson or a Stuart Broad, then it gets very tricky, right? How do you assess the value of two very different cricketers?
Very, very difficult question. And again, will depend on the balance of the side and various other factors.
Yeah, just to, I know you said you would comfortably pick Sunil Gavaskar, but would you do the same if you're doing that, say, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, throughout the 80s for Kapil? Would you do the same given what India had, a much stronger batting lineup and bowling lineup? Would you still pick Sunil Gavaskar as a more useful cricketer for the team than Kapil Dev for that Indian team? I'm just curious to know.
I mean, we could probably zero in on phases where Kapil was certainly more valuable to the team, and it also didn't help that the Sunny's second half of his career was not as prolific as the first half at large. Plus there are patches where he had a fairly lean run. Even his record against West Indies, which gets talked about quite a lot for both good and bad, has its own conditions apply asterisks attached to it, because his performance against the pace battery is not as good as it is against the overall West Indies since he started. Certainly that's a very valid point. That certainly if you look at just the 80s, where you have Kapil's peak and a little bit of a relative lean for Sunny, plus a stronger batting lineup, Kapil is probably more valuable.
Okay, yeah, I think it just comes down to team balance in most cases when it's not as clear cut.
Yeah, so in fact, there was a segue for us to actually talk about the more meaty subject of the pitfalls of talking about all-rounders, of talking about the differences, of talking about the near parity of skills. It's as if Chris Gaines somehow, because of his near parity of skills, becomes a superior cricketer to Sean Pollock or something like that. I know that's an absurd example, but a lot of the current obsession with all-rounder discussion seems to go along these lines. In fact, yesterday I read an article on Cricinfo, which puts so much focus on, one, the difference in averages, which is kind of ridiculous, because if Bradman had to bowl and he averaged 70 with the ball, his difference would still be superior to Sobers in Callis or whatever.
Exactly, and that's why I say it's too biased towards batting all-rounders, one minus the other.
Yeah, just one alternative thought can break open the fallacy in that number. That's one thing. And there are other parameters like, like the making things happen thing where they had a stat on the percentage of partnerships broken by a bowler when the partnership is across 50. And very naturally, it's going to favor someone like Stokes because he's a Broad or an Anderson is going to dismiss batsmen even before a partnership has reached 50. Stokes is only going to come in when partnerships have flourished and they need to give rest to the mainstream bowlers or they need to try something new. And Stokes, typically being a fifth or a sixth bowler and occasionally fourth bowler as well, has a greater probability of making things happen. But that is just by the design of the game. It's got nothing to do with Stokes' extraordinary ability to make things happen. So the larger point that I want to kind of discuss about is with this whole all-rounder obsession by kind of adding up two fairly unrelated numbers to make a greater whole. Is that good for cricket? And that is from a theoretical academic discussion like you and I are having. But even otherwise, within a team setup, like you take England right now, for example, you have Stokes, you have Sam Curran, you have Wokes. Now, you could play all three, right? Sam Curran could play 100 tests, average 30, 35 at the bat, and possibly 30 with the ball. And that's going to be a phenomenal stat, but that's not ideally good for the team. So is this all-rounder obsession, can it go to fairly unhealthy boundaries?
I mean, it can if you sacrifice the balance of the team to fit in the best players on paper. And it's a problem that England have been having recently. As you said, too many good... They already have Broad and Anderson as proven performers in Test cricket with the ball over a number of years. Chris Woakes is excellent in English conditions. Sam Curran, again, could easily play in home conditions as well. And then you've got people like Wood hasn't done so well at home, and Archer's obviously got the talent. You can't fit them all into the side, even though on paper, someone like a Chris Woakes or someone like a Sam Curran is more valuable than someone like a Zach Crawley, who's a frontline batsman. So it's a kind of a problem that England have been facing. They don't have that many good batsmen, but they have so many good bowlers, and a lot of the good bowlers that they have can also bat. So I would argue you're correct, because, for example, in this Test match that we see England versus Pakistan, you've got this ridiculous situation of, you say ridiculous, but Chris Woakes is batting at number 7. I mean, you're playing a batsman short. You've got Jos Buttler, who hasn't been scoring that many runs, batting at number 6. So this is a prime example of your point, Mahesh, about the unhealthy obsession of picking people who can do both. At the same time, looking at this specific Test match, there's a general principle, but looking at this specific Test match, I guess England felt that you can't leave Broad and Anderson out. They need Archer for the extra pace. Woakes in home conditions is too good, and they've got need the spinner. But ultimately, I think you've got to pick your best 4 bowlers and deal with it, and then play 6 batsmen and have the keeper at 7. Just because you're adding the value of a player up, and they come to more than another player, they don't fit the balance of the side. There's no need for them. And as you said, you've even got Ben Stokes' fitness as a bit of a cloud, but you've got Ben Stokes there. What's the point of having him as a 6th bowler? If he's an all-rounder, you may as well have him as assuming he's fit, you should have him as a 5th bowler.
So what are the other narrative fallacies around all-rounders that kind of annoy you, that kind of irritate you, or that deserves more nuance? Is there something that you have which are favorites?
For me, I guess it's kind of people do this thing where they mix formats up. So you can get people who are certainly good one-day all-rounders. But when it comes to Test matches, they're not all-rounders. But people sometimes think they are. That's a slight annoyance for me sometimes. Because it takes a very different thing to be a Test all-rounder compared to a one-day all-rounder.
For me, it's about looking at the overall career stats. It's because the thing about all-rounders is that most of them started very young. If you look at all the 10 names we picked, 8 of them started as teenagers or maybe 20, 21. And the only 2 who didn't start were for non-cricketing reasons. Tony Greig had to wait the residency period in England, and Keith Miller had to wait because of the Second World War, although he made his debut as a specialist batsman in first-class cricket and made 81 at the age of 18. So, these guys are phenomenally talented cricketers. So they're going to develop their secondary skill with time. So when you look at their overall stats, not all of them are going to, stand out. And so that's my thing. Like, for instance, if you look at Richie Benaud, his batting average is lower than his bowling average. So you automatically go, was he really an all-rounder? But then you look at the faces, and we'll talk about it a bit more later on when the right opportunity comes up. You would say, okay, he was a very good all-rounder. So for me, that looking at someone's entire career, because these are talented bunch, they take time to develop. So they're going to be strong at something. In some cases, they start as the strongest in something and they end up being the opposite. Like Keith Miller, Aubrey Faulkner, they just, they reversed their roles. So for me, the only annoying thing about people comparing all-rounders is looking at the entire career stats. And this applies to not just all-rounders, but for specialist batsmen, bowlers as well. People compare, especially across eras, they look at the number of test matches. For me, you don't look at the number of test matches, you look at the number of years. Like, for instance, I'm using Service as an example all the time, mainly because I remember his numbers off the top of my head more than anyone else. And also, they are the most extreme, phenomenal numbers, so it's easy to put it in context. Like, he had an 8-year peak as an all-rounder from early 1960s to 1968 when he had the floating bone in his left shoulder. He couldn't bowl spin. In that 8.5 or 9-year period, his batting average was in the mid-60s and his bowling average was 27, 28. And that is phenomenal. Imagine, batting average of mid-60s and bowling average 27, 28 for 8 years. But sadly, he only played 33 test matches in those 8 years. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure someone like Alistair Cook would have played 100-plus test matches in 8 years. So the other second thing that annoys me, not just for all-rounders, but for anyone, comparing number of test matches. You've got to look at number of years and make adjustments for it so that, there is an equality in scale. It also applies even modern-day cricketers. We posted few match frequency tables. I don't know whether you saw, for like people like Tendulkar in the 90s, how he didn't play enough test matches, and early 90s. And Eunice Khan, Andy Flower, we put up some tables on CricVestigate. And how they were in their prime and didn't play enough matches. But whereas someone from England or Australia would be playing so many test matches, so they maximize their peak. So that reflects in the overall career stats. So yeah, for me, you have to look at long, substantial segments, not just 1 year or 2 years, but 8, 9 years, and look with some sort of context.
It's a terrific point, Rav. In fact, like you said, that applies to more than just all-rounders. And the Sachin number is something that has haunted me for a long time, because personally, I like the Sachin between 94 and 99, and that's his absolute peak as a batsman. And if you look at the average number of tests he played during that era, is a joke, because India was obsessed with one-days at that time. And we played about 35 to 40 one-days every year. That really sold him short as a test batsman. Extending on that point, even when it comes to all-rounders, there are two things, right? One, these players start young and the secondary skills take time to develop. But even in the case of, let's say, someone like Daniel Vettori or Heath Streak, who started out as bowlers, but subsequently kind of improved their batting so much that during a fairly substantial phase, they were genuine all-rounders. If you look at the overall numbers, that's not going to appear so, particularly for someone like Heath Streak. Or someone like Ashwin, for instance, who had a terrific period as an all-rounder for a fairly long time, but his batting kind of tapered off after that. So if you look at his overall record, obviously, especially if he continues in the current sort of form in batting for another 5 years, he may not even be considered an all-rounder after a while. But fact is, for about 5 years, he was a genuine all-rounder. So yeah, it's a very, very valid point. Sort of taking off from there, and given Rav set it up pretty well, that most of these players start very young, and one, the secondary skills take time to develop, and more importantly, even their body, right? To how the body copes up with the workload over time. When you're 20, 21, 22, your body could take a lot, but over time, it's going to be much harder, and that we've seen with Callis, with Sobers themselves, that where they went through phases where the secondary skill could not be as robust as it used to be. So given how difficult it is to, first of all, find an all-rounder with that level of skills, and two, to have the body and the fitness to cope up with it pretty much throughout, is it realistically possible for a cricketing ecosystem to even nurture an all-rounder? Is it, like, for instance, India was obsessed with creating fast bowlers. And at that time, you ask anybody, you ask Dennis Lilly, you ask any of the great fast bowlers, what should India do to create fast bowlers? There was a very clear prescriptive message that they can give, do these things and you're very likely to produce fast bowlers. But is it even possible to give such a prescriptive thing to nurturing an all-rounder?
I mean, I don't think there is. I can't see. It's a very difficult thing to do because, as Rav correctly said, you look at the age that these guys started. I think they're often freaks of nature. You can't plan it. I mean, England spent a long time after Ian Botham retired trying to find the next Botham, trying to shoehorn people into that role. But no one even came close to him until Andrew Flintoff came in, who wasn't as good, but still was a very fine all-rounder. And so I think it's very difficult. Look at Gary Sobers, the greatest. I mean, he influenced so many West Indians, but since he played, they haven't had another one. Even, you look at the South Africans. South Africans are incredible. They produced, in the 70s, they produced, 5 all-rounders, 4 or 5 all-rounders. In the late 90s, they produced 4 or 5 all-rounders. Dr. Ali Bakr, who captained the side in the 70s that beat Australia, the side that beat the touring Australians 4-0. And also he was in administration and knew the late 90s players very well. He wrote a book called Jacques Kallis and 12 Other All-Rounders, where he looks into the South African all-rounders. But he himself can't actually come up with a reason as to why South Africa produced the all-rounders and what the secret was. It's kind of the only thing you can think of in their case is a sporting culture. But there's no clear reason and way I can see of just producing these all-rounders. Otherwise, people would have been doing it. They just seem to just pop up.
Yeah. So, Rao, would you agree that they're just freaks of nature, that we should just be fortunate to get once in a while?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, I've covered all the points pretty much. I can't think of it, like why West Indies haven't produced one since Gary Sobers. And it's like, England, they were chasing, pretty much they were trying to make all-rounders out of so many people, and then it didn't happen. And you can, bet your bottom dollar that England would have had the system in place to try and create the next Botham. It just didn't happen. And same goes for Australia. Like, since Keith Miller, we didn't really have a test quality all-rounder. I mean, Shane Watson was a fantastic one-day all-rounder. Oh, please do not get me started on that. But I mean, Shane Watson was decent. He's like somewhat of an inferior version of Kallis in both sense. But he was a fantastic audio all-rounder. Like, Australia haven't produced one. So, and I'm pretty sure Australia have a pretty good system in developing cricketers, but they're just freaks of natures. Like we said earlier, they all started very young. I think,
So talking of, now that we all agree that the freaks of nature and it's an absolute accident that we get all-rounders, I'm a little, and Aj already covered it to some extent, where even Ali Bakr says we don't know why we produce so many all-rounders. And talking of England, even though Botham phenomenon didn't kind of lead on to a system, but England did produce 3 iconic all-rounders. When I say iconic, I mean including Flintoff, because for a brief period he was. Pretty much in the last 50 years, right? You had Botham, and then they were talking about next Botham. There was all kinds of people, Alex Tudor, Ronnie, they included everybody. But eventually they found Flintoff. And pretty soon after they found Stokes. Is there something, of course there is no meritorious cricketing system-driven logic here. Perhaps it's the obsession of the society or whatever. Is there something that explains this 3 iconic all-rounders plus a flurry of all-rounders in South Africa? Does that explain something about the society or the ecosystem that they operate in?
Very tough question, Mahesh. But I'll try and answer it. As far as I'm concerned, England in the last 50 years, you wouldn't say they had a particular bowler or a batsman who you'd classify as, absolutely all-time great. But Ian Botham was an all-time great player, and he was like a massive hero in England. He was every child's hero. So that must have led to many people desiring and wanting to become all-rounders. But it still took a while after he retired for someone to filter through. And the same with Flintoff. Flintoff captured the imagination in that, of course, that famous 2005 Ashes series. And for 3 years between 2003 and 2005, those 3 years, he was phenomenal. And he was box office stuff. People wanted to watch cricket because of him. And kids who were following cricket at that stage, because it was still on the national TV, they would have actually, Flintoff would have definitely been the hero. So that's the only kind of angle I can sort of get on it, where that people who were watching cricket would have watched it for those players at that time. The casual fans would have watched it for those players, and it may have inspired people to try and become all-rounders. But it's very, very difficult to pin a reason as to why it happened for stuff that we've mentioned. The South Africans I've always just been amazed by. I just can't explain it. It's amazing. And what's even more amazing, in that late 90s side, for a brief time when they had Callis, Pollock, Brian McMillan and Klusner. On top of that, you also had people who didn't quite make the all-rounder category, like Pat Simcox, who averaged 28 with the bat down the order. He's actually won some test matches with his batting. And then you've got someone like Hansi Cronje.
And was dropped immediately after scoring 100.
Exactly. And he even the likes of Hansi Cronje. You remember Tendulkar said the hardest South African bowler to face was Cronje. So their side was really a multi-talented side. The 1970s side was phenomenal. I mean, you had Mike Proctor was a serious player. He didn't get to play obviously more than 7 tests, and then you had Trevor Goddard, who was coming to the end by that point, was fantastic, and then Eddie Barlow, and then Tiger Lance, and Clyde Rice didn't get to play any tests, but he made his first-class debut the previous year. This is all phenomenal stuff, and people have looked into it. I mean, South Africa right now would die for having some of these all-rounders, but they just can't seem to produce it. So I'm kind of repeating myself and not really answering your question, but I think that's because I don't think there is a clear answer, unless Rav has something to pull out.
No, it would just purely be speculative. You know how I like to stick to my empiricals. Now, the only thing I can think of is, like you mentioned, that there's this massive sporting culture in South Africa that they play in different sports, and it's the same in Australia. So Australia haven't produced anything. I mean, when I was in high school, I had to play 4 different sports for 4 different seasons, and I was like, I wish there was indoor cricket and stuff. No, because I would have loved to play 4 different seasons of cricket. So I had to find 3 other sports to play here. So we do have a sporting culture here as well. And I played chess for 1 season. Don't ask me why. It was considered sport for some reason. But Australia haven't produced as many as South Africa. So I can't really answer that. It's a pretty big sporting culture in Australia as well, especially in Victoria. But I don't know. I can only speculate. Even speculation, I don't know where to start. I would just say I would probably, say they're just freaks of nature. I can't really see how one country could produce more than the other, or what sort of system.
I mean, Mahesh, to throw the question back to you, although that's the wrong way around. Someone like Kapil Dev, I mean, such a phenomenal player and such an influence on Indian cricket. I mean, why do you think that there hasn't been more? You had Manoj Prabhakar as well, but why do you think there hasn't been more kind of fast bowling all-rounders in India?
Okay,
just because of the condition.
The reason I ask you this question is because, it's a fairly heavy question. With obviously, even if you do a PhD on this topic, you're not going to get a definitive answer. It is just to get a sense of a very pet theory that you have, just a random theory that all of us have to explain the world. And the reason why I asked you is because I found this sort of personal theory, which has absolutely no grounding on any empirical evidence or whatever. It's purely my subjective opinion, is the fact that once I heard Usman talk about why Pakistan was able to produce fast bowlers pretty much like in an assembly line once Imran came through, and why other countries, particularly India, which shares a border, which has in some ways similar culture, people have given all kinds of rubbish theories about Pakistan is eating beef, because there are also a lot of Indians eating beef. And that doesn't really explain it. And Osman made this point, which at that time, which is actually a point that you also made now, is the fact that Imran was such a hero, such a massive hero for the population of Pakistan, that he just created a much wider base of cricketers trying to be fast bowlers. And naturally, when the base widens, you're going to end up with a much better shortlist eventually filtering through, and that automatically produces hopefully better bowlers. I found that a very convincing explanation, the power of hero. And to answer your question on Kapil, it's actually true that Kapil did inspire a generation of people to kind of mimic him, to follow him. You had Chetan Sharma, you had Manoj Prabhakar. That's, of course, at the international level. But you look a little lower, like someone like Ratinder Singh Sodhi, for instance, who won the Under-15 World Cup for India, was part of the Under-19 World Cup winning team, which Kaif captained in Sri Lanka in the late 90s. He grew up, like he was a topic of Indian cricket for many years. And he modeled himself on Kapil. He said, if I could be 20% of Kapil, I'll be very happy. You had Lakshmi Ratan Shukla from Bengal, who was talked of as the next Kapil. It's a very similar to Botham phenomenon in England, for instance. When Alex Tudor came up, they said he's the next Botham. There's so many all-rounders. Anybody who could bat and bowl a bit, essentially it widens the base. And in a country like Pakistan, especially at that time when cricket pretty much took over the mainstream consciousness, the base really widened. Unfortunately, in India, perhaps the cricket infrastructure was not good enough, or maybe just the quality was not enough. But the base was certainly widening after Kapil. It was just not coming through to the top player, possibly because it's easier to produce fast bowlers through a system, plus through this hero inspiration. But it's much more difficult to produce an all-rounder like we discussed earlier. But that's probably the only convincing personal explanation that I have to make sense of this phenomenon.
Actually, Mahesh, I think that's a very good explanation. And it actually makes sense to me, because I think it then circles back to our point that heroes can inspire you to become a batsman or a bowler, but all-rounders are just kind of freaks of nature. So when people wanted to copy Imran Khan, they copied his stronger suit, which was his bowling. They worked hard on that. But it's very difficult for them to also do the batting at the same time. That's the only thing I can... Your explanation to me makes some kind of sense.
But if I may add something to that, even Imran Khan himself became a very decent batsman towards the end. So if it took a man of that talent to develop into a decent batsman that many years, you can't really expect people half as talented as him to be good all-rounders, because it took Imran that long to be a very decent batsman. So...
Yeah, so I think with that, all speculation part of the episode is done with. But it's kind of interesting to pick up on what are your personal theories behind things that you can't really explain, right? Okay, moving on. The other aspect of all-rounders that I want to touch upon is the fact that, Firdaus wrote this about Kallis, for instance, calling him the ultimate luxury, which is, for a team like South Africa, which is what it was, right? Kallis bowling was an absolute luxury. He could have been a third or a fourth bowler in any other team. But given the riches of fast bowling reserves that they had, he was the ultimate luxury. Does that, in fact, oversell the value of an all-rounder? The fact that it is essentially a luxury for the team, but because we as fans are obsessed about the additivity of the numbers. To give you another example, this is a wicket-keeping all-rounder, Andy Flower. Zimbabwe could so easily have found another specialist wicket-keeper who was as good as another batsman in the team who was not Andy Flower, and could have relieved him of his duties to keep as well. So in a way, it was an extra luxury which was not really adding to the team in some sense. Which is not to criticize Andy Flower. I'm just saying, just because someone is multifaceted doesn't mean it's going to add to the value to the team. Is that a fair point to make?
It depends on the specific circumstance. It varies from player to player. So if we look at Andy Flower, as you mentioned, it's hard to say, because actually, if you look at his stats, his averages when he wasn't keeping was actually a lot worse, his batting averages. But I think he only played something like 8 tests, not as a keeper. So it's kind of hard to read too much into it. But I never got the impression that Flowers, the keeping must have tired him because he was batting in the top order. But it's hard to say how many more runs he would make if he wasn't the keeper. And it's also hard to say how much worse a batsman the alternative keeper would have been than their specialist batsman they would have picked because Flower was keeping. So with Flower, I don't think it's a clear answer.
Let me give you another example. Let's say taking off on Flower. Sangakkara, for instance, went on to become a much better batsman once he gave up the gloves. Yeah. And they found Prasanna Jayawardene, who replaced another batsman very clearly. But Sri Lanka did not suffer, not just because Sangakkara became a much better batsman, but even otherwise Prasanna Jayawardene was an adequate batsman when he replaced a batsman, right?
Right, that's a very good point, Mahesh. Sri Lanka, on the whole, benefited from Sangakkara giving up the gloves, but there's a couple of factors here. At the time when Sangakkara started off as a wicketkeeper, Sri Lanka actually had a lot of good batsmen. They could have played 7 proper batsmen, including Sangakkara as keeper, in their side. They had the names. They had Jayasuriya, Atapattu, Sangakkara, Jayawardene, Samarawira, Tilakaratne was around then. So they could Dilshan, they could have fitted them all in. So there was that's why there was a reluctance to give the gloves to someone else. But then when Sangakkara gave up the gloves, as you said, his batting output went from an average of 40 to 66 because he was batting in the top 3. It made such a big difference. Also, another factor which should be slightly brought in is the fact that his batting peak, when he started tinkering with his technique, also coincided with him giving up the gloves as well. So not all of that, a lot of that game was because he gave up the gloves, but not all of that game was due to that. And the other point to make was that, so I think Prasanna Jayawardene's batting was decent. It wasn't as good as if they had played a specialist batsman, but the increase in runs from Sangakkara made up for that. And also, Prasanna Jayawardene was a better wicketkeeper against spin than Sangakkara. So the overall benefit to the side was clearly there. So I'd agree with you. Sangakkara as a pure batsman was more valuable to the side than as an all-round, as a wicketkeeper batsman.
I can't let this opportunity pass without bringing in Sovis again. I'll be quick. When Sovis first made his 100, his maiden 100 was the 365. From that point onwards, till towards the end of 1960, when they went to Australia, his batting average in that 3-year period, he made over 2,000 runs at an average of 98.4. And he largely batted in the top 4. I think his average in 3 and 4 were well over 100 for 1,600 runs. And but then when he became the all-rounder, around the time of that Tide Test series, he developed his bowling a lot while he was playing for the Sheffield Shield for those 3 years. His numbers were phenomenal. Like, he was making 100 runs per test and taking almost 6 wickets per test, which you would have heard Ian Chappell mention on several interviews. But when he went down the order after he started bowling a lot, I would just get rid of all the filters and then just go the entire career of Sobers. His batting average at number 3 was 72. He made over 1,000 runs. And his batting average at number 4 made over 1,500 runs, was 64. His batting average at number 5 was almost 60. But his most common batting position over his entire career was number 6, which was wherein he averaged a moderate, by his standards, 53. So you can see how the bowling responsibility made him slide down from number 3, averaging 72, to averaging 53 at number 6. So in his case, it definitely affected his batting. But West Indies weren't the strongest side by any stretch of the imagination, especially in terms of bowling, because Sobers was one of the leading wicket takers for West Indies in that time. And so his bowling was a lot more useful to the side, although, you could argue it was only half as good as his batting.
But Sobers being an all-rounder certainly helped the team. Right? He could have been a batsman averaging 75, or he could have been a batsman averaging nearly 60, but a bowler averaging 30s. And exactly. That suited West Indies cricket much better.
Yes, his bowling suited West Indies cricket much better, and then him batting at number 5, 6, and to control the game from there. Whenever West Indies was in trouble, he would make 100. When West Indies were, 4 for 300 or 400, you wouldn't see many Sobers hundreds or 50s from that batting position. He just didn't have to score, which enabled him to take the new ball and take in a couple of wickets, especially if it's a Boycott or Barrington. So, like you said, exactly. Him being a all-rounder with very, very good bowling made a huge difference to West Indies than him averaging that extra 10, 15 runs in the bat.
Okay, so let's move on to the other tricky aspect of all-rounders, and it's always been a fairly dicey definition, or that of wicket-keeping all-rounders. I have two questions on this. One, would you consider a wicket-keeping batsman as all-rounders? Actually, I have three questions. Two is, do you really find the fact that teams choose better batsmen essentially by sort of settling for a lesser keeper, if that had to happen? And the third question is, how important was the Gilchrist phenomenon? And the reason why I'm asking is that pretty much the entire cricketing universe talks about the role of wicket keepers having changed post-Gilchrist, which is actually not, if you go factually, may not be true, because we had Andy Flower before that, we had Alex Stewart before that. If you go further back in history, I don't know how to pronounce this name, but let's say Les Amis. Is that a French name or Ames?
Les Ames, yeah.
Yeah. So there is enough sample, and even Alan Knott was a very handy batsman for his time. How do you assess the Gilchrist phenomenon?
Okay. Like you said, those names, Les Ames, Alan Knott, and all those guys, they were sort of, once in a blue moon sort of cricketers. Like there weren't too many of them. Because I got some numbers for you. Let's not go too far because 19th century could affect the numbers so badly. So if I take the last 40 years of the 20th century, the top 7 batsmen averaged almost 37. This is non-wicket keepers, right? And in the last 20 years, so 21st century, the top 7 batsmen averaged 38, just over. So the difference is 1 to 1.5 runs. So there was no change in normal batsmen. So you can say things have been even. But when you look at the wicket-keeping batsmen in the last 40 years of 20th century, their batting average was just over 25. Whereas if you look at the last 20 years, their batting average is 32.5. That's a massive 7-run increase. And most people actually have this theory that everyone's expected to bat these days, which might be true. It is an expectation, but it's not the reality. So what I did is I looked up the numbers for batsmen, tailenders, who are not wicket keepers, from number 8, 9, 10, 11. The last 40 years of 20th century, their batting average is 14.4, whereas the last 20 years, so the 21st century, is 15.07. So it's an increase of 0.6 runs per wicket. And if you tell that to anyone, they're like, nah, that can't be right. But that is raw data. And so although there's an expectation that the tailenders are expected to bat, it just hasn't happened. And top 7 batsmen, they haven't improved much. It's the same, 37 and 38. But wicket keepers went from 21.6 to 32.5, which meant the Gilchrist phenomenon actually is true. Out of the 3 aspects of the game, top order batsmen, tailenders, and wicket keepers, the only thing that improved significantly over the last 60 years, if you separate it by 40 and 20 years, because Gilchrist started playing in 99, wicket-keeping was the only thing that on raw data has improved significantly. So I would say that his legacy has been quite strong and immediate. Sometimes, the legacy takes a while to happen because 10, 11-year-olds looking at them, it takes them 10, 15 years to become those inspired by them. But so I do think that it has improved their batting in wicket-keeping more than the other 2. Do you have anything about the balance here? I remember you mentioned a very good point, Arch, about Gilchrist.
Obviously, no one would disagree. He's one of the greatest of all time as a keeper batsman. He's a phenomenal player. But actually, he didn't affect I'm one of the category. I don't classify wicketkeepers as all-rounders. And he didn't actually affect the balance of the Australian side, because they still played the 6 batsmen, Gilchrist, and the 4 bowlers. Because they had a very, very fine spinner in Shane Warne, one of the greatest. They could afford to have a 4-man attack. They didn't need to play a 5th bowler. Now, had they needed to play a 5th bowler, they could have possibly dropped one of the specialist batsmen and picked an all-rounder. And Gilchrist's batting would have allowed them to do that. But they didn't need to do that. So Gilchrist actually didn't affect the balance of the Australian side in any way. Before Gilchrist, you had Ian Healy. He batted at 7, nowhere near as good a batsman as Gilchrist. So Gilchrist was just a phenomenon in that he just brought more runs to the roll in crucial situations. And based on the stats that Rav just said, you'd say a wicketkeeper batsman looks like he's on runs on average is worth about 3/4 of a batsman contribution, whereas someone like Gilchrist was actually better than the average specialist batsman. So he was adding so much value as a player, and he's one of the greatest, but he didn't actually affect the balance of the side the way that someone like Jacques Kallis may have done.
That's true. Sorry, I just want to clarify on this a little bit because I'm acutely aware of the fact that Gilchrist did bring about a dramatic increase in averages of wicketkeeper batsmen. The question I want to kind of drill on is, was that a change? Like, is it similar to the Imran Khan phenomenon that I spoke about a little earlier? Is it because Gilchrist inspired a generation of keepers to be better batsmen? Because then that would have taken a little bit of time. There would have been a lag effect, right? But in this case, it was fairly smooth. It's almost as if the wicket-keeping batting average rose right alongside Gilchrist's career, which is very much explained by the fact that the team management started changing their approach to keepers. Like England went for Grant Jones, India went for Deedas Gupta, for instance. So in this, even before Gilchrist could inspire a generation of keepers to be better batsmen, the team management started, kind of compromising a little bit on wicket-keeping skills for the sake of better batting. Is that something that makes sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's... sorry, you go, Aj.
No, you go first.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, yeah, you're right. Like, yeah, it would have taken a while for people to be inspired and then continue that. But it also, like you said, the management started to look at wicket keepers who could be better contributors. So like Aj said, I agree with Aj. As great a value as Gilchrist was to Australia, he didn't impact the Australian selection as much or their balance. But what he did was he affected the rest of the world's selection criteria. Like the rest of the world, started going for the decent keepers who could bat better than like top quality keepers who weren't really good at batting. And I'm guessing there's a question about Saha and Pant here.
No, I mean, I also think Pant is not a batsman who's made to keep. So Pant is also a genuine keeper. That's a slightly different equation.
Mahesh, actually, I think I'm not clear. I may have a disagreement with Rav slightly on this one. I'm not clear that Gilchrist did inspire people because I don't think he's just a freak of nature. As much as he inspires, you can't in such a short time period. You can't. People may try and copy him, but you can't get a player of that quality. But I think in general, it was already happening, like you said, outside of Gilchrist. Even if you move away from Test cricket, the emphasis on keeper batting was already there, and people were starting to shortchange on the keeper to improve the batting. You remember the Indian one-day side, for example. Rahul Dravid was made to keep, that kind of a thing.
In one-day cricket, it was happening for a while. I mean, even the most overblown impact of Kalutarna, for instance, thanks to Tony Greig's hype. But the fact is, even before that, Junior Murray, for instance, opened the batting in Australia for West Indies. So in one-day cricket, it was already changing. But in Test cricket... Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, Junior Murray, I remember that was a pretty poor experiment in South Africa where I think Clayton Lambert and Philo Wallace tried to slog Donald Pollock around and then they'd run out of openers. So they just sent this guy, Junior Murray, up to open. He did open in one-day
quite well
well.
in a tri-series in Australia. He did quite okay.
One-day cricket, yeah, you're right. Yeah, he did.
But in Test cricket, in fact, you're right about Test cricket as well, that there was a phase of keepers like Boucher was a better batsman than Richardson and McCullum. When did McCullum make his debut?
McCullum made his debut around 2003, 2004.
Yeah, but he was not someone who saw Gilchrist and started getting inspired and batted better. He must have grown up as this genuine batsman who also is a genuine keeper. So in the sense, it was already a theme that was developing in cricket, and Gilchrist happens to be the poster boy right in the middle of it.
Yeah, it might be just one of those things that evolved over time, a bit like outfielding. Outfielding now is far better than it was in the olden days. I think slip fielding is probably worse, but outfielding is certainly better. So it could be something where it's just something that's expected now. In the old days in England, you could get a player like a Bob Taylor who didn't get to play that much for England, but he only averaged 16, I think. And someone like Bob Taylor today wouldn't make the side. You just wouldn't pick a keeper who averaged 16 with a bat. Doesn't matter how good his keeping is, you just wouldn't pick him. So it's a cultural change as well.
Yeah, that's precisely the point I was driving at. That Gilchrist not only, in fact, I don't know who said that. The fact that he didn't disrupt the balance of Australian team, but he disrupted the rest of the teams is so apt, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah. I mean, the number of times he destroyed teams from when Australia were 5 down is unbelievable.
Do you want some interesting stats about Gilchrist?
Yes, please.
So everyone knows about his batting average, close to 48, and he was averaging over 60, almost at halfway mark, and averaging 55 plus and all that. Everyone knows about these things. But two of my favorite stats are related to stats on tour. So throughout Gilchrist's career, Australia did not lose a single match overseas, a single tour opener. Every single tour, Australia won the first match of the series. And that's thanks largely to Gilchrist, because his batting average in those first test of the series was 72 for a wicketkeeper. And he made 100 in every 3 innings for a guy batting at number 7. Let me reiterate. He made 100 every 3 innings on the first test of the tour. And when he was batting second, which means Australia already fielded, it was 90 plus. He made 100 every second innings. And he averaged 60 plus in every continent. I mean, New Zealand falls under the 5th continent, yes. That's my, one of the favorite stats about why Australia was so successful on tours, in addition to McGrath and Shane Warne, outside of India for one. So that's fine. And then second stat was that how many innings he took for every 100. His frequency was almost as good as Steve Smith on tour. His frequency of hundreds on overseas test matches are better than Alan Border, Steve Waugh, and name anyone. Only 3 Australians have better frequency than Gilchrist: Don Bradman, Neil Harvey, and Steve Smith. So that's the sort of freak he was. And my last bit of stat is that out of his test hundreds, 11 of them came in second, third, and fourth innings. In 8 of those, Australia were trailing, and the average trailing number was 175. So 8 of his 11 hundreds came when Australia was effectively 5 for negative 175. And out of the 3 times Australia had a lead, 2 of them were 15 or 20 and then 40. The only time Australia had a lead when he made a second, third, fourth innings 100 was that, a significant lead, was that 2006 Ashes test when he just went bananas for the second fastest 100. So that's the sort of player he was. And I guess that's the sort of impact probably influenced the rest of the world to look at their way of selection. So, yeah, anyway, I just thought there was some really fascinating numbers.
Arj already answered this question, but Rav, you have not. Would you consider wicket-keeping batsmen as all-rounders? In that case, would you invite comparison with Sobers and Imran for someone like Sangakkara or Gilchrist?
I don't consider them a proper all-rounder, but at the same time, maybe I'm sort of in the middle of considering them proper and not at all. I think Arj might be on the not at all sort of category, but yeah, it's very difficult to call them a proper all-rounder because it's not binary who's better keeper, who's better batsman. It's about the overall value. And I'll quickly use an example of Saha and Pant. I think the batting average difference is only 8. I think it's 30 and 38 or something. It's a small sample size for a shout. But if you look at the runs per test, which it's all about, individual brilliance is reflected in the averages. But at the end of the day, it's a team game. It's all about the team contribution. It doesn't matter if someone makes 100 runs out twice and the other one makes 70 runs, but batted twice, but not out once. You might have an average of 70 and the other guy would be 50, but other guy made 30 more runs for the team. So obviously, it depends on the batting position and opportunities. So it's about team contribution. And when it comes to that, I think off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure, but I think Pant runs per test is like 60 plus and Saha is 33 or something. So it's a massive difference. And we don't have wicket-keeping metric, but recently saw someone saying against spin, Saha concedes something like -2 runs per test and Rishabh like -8 per test. Just based on numbers, it's not much bigger difference. So not talking about conditions, in India or outside India, but in general, I would be inclined to pick Rishabh personally. But so does it mean I'm thinking they are all-rounders or not? I don't know. I don't really have a straightforward answer, to be honest. I don't think they're genuine all-rounders like the batting and bowling all-rounders, but I think you have to look at the overall value as a cricketer, and which sort of implies they're all-rounders. So I'm sort of contradicting myself, but I'm sort of in the neutral there.
But just to chip in, sorry, Mahesh, one quick thing. Just to chip in, one trend I have noticed which links all-rounders with wicketkeepers, or players who are doing two things, is that their primary skill often tends to be slightly underrated because of their secondary skill. I've kind of noticed it. So, you forget that. I remember when Matt Pryor was playing for England, people forgot that he was actually a 40 averaging batsman and could have probably played inside as a batsman, arguably. Or Sobers, as Rav correctly says, is the second greatest batsman, but people often don't classify him in as a batsman. I remember, for example, Richie Benaud was picking his 11, and he picked Sobers, of course, and then he was coming to the second all-rounder, and it was a straight-out shootout between, Imran Khan, I think it was Ian Botham, probably Hadley, etc. And he went for Imran Khan, which is fine. But then when he came to the bowlers, Hadley didn't get a shot to compete for a bowling spot. So it was almost like he had been put in a box as an all-rounder, and it meant that his primary skill had been underrated.
No, that's very true. That's it's particularly about Hadley, right? That's in fact, it affects Hadley more than anybody else, I think. Like when you're talking about Callis, despite it's a very similar equation, right? He's a phenomenal batsman and a more than handy bowler, but not necessarily a frontline bowler. And similar case, mirror image of that for Hadley. But people are always willing to concede Callis as a batsman as well as an all-rounder. But with Hadley, he always gets undersold, short-sold as a bowler alone.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd argue even Gilchrist, as much as people rate him, people, as a pure batsman, that's why Rav stats were so interesting, because as a pure batsman, you don't really put him up there with the very best, but he's not that far off. I mean, based on Rav stats and in general, from what I've watched and seen and studied, Gilchrist is, as a pure batsman alone, if he couldn't keep at all, he'd still be a phenomenal player.
Absolutely. He would have been the second best batsman in the team after Ponting.
I mean, some could even argue on tours he was probably a better batsman. I mean, not probably. He was a better batsman. He averaged more than Ponting. He made more hundreds, more frequently he made hundreds than Ponting on tours. So he didn't really have to do much in Australia when you have a batting lineup of Hayden, Langer, Ponting, Martin. Everyone was really good at home. And I remember, not for this, but I prepared some data for something else. And then throughout Ponting's career, Australia's top 7 batting average, this happens to include Gilchrist, was 45. You know how many other teams didn't even have a 45 averaging batsman, a single batsman? This is a collective top 7 batting average throughout Ponting's career for 2 decades. It's not like his peak or anything. They had a top 7 batting average of 45. That's insane. And that's partly because, at home they were phenomenal. And most of them are very good overseas as well. But I think Gilchrist was probably the best Australian batsman in that time outside of Australia.
Forget other teams. I think even Australia themselves would have liked to ration it out between generations.
For sure. I mean, Darren Lehmann was a phenomenal batsman. He averaged about 65 plus for Yorkshire. And I remember just an outstanding batsman, just couldn't play enough tests for Australia. And not just him, Stuart Law, Brad Hodge, you name it. There were some class players who didn't get to play enough for them and would have walked into their team over the last 10 years.
Yeah, even Markov made his debut pretty late. Michael Hussey, of course, made it extremely late.
Yeah, absolutely. Their second 11.
Yeah, sorry. Moving on, I know we could pick our favorite all-rounders or whatever, but I want to make it a little interesting for our two guests. So how about picking an all-rounders 11, but not just 11 best all-rounders, but all-rounders playing in their positions. So from openers to new ball bowlers.
Okay. Well, that's it's going to be interesting. Okay, I think we should start with the obvious choices for the top-tier batsmen and bowlers among the all-rounders that we have. Let's skip the openers for now. It's a bit tricky, so we'll come back to that at the end. So let's start from number 3. As I already made it clear, it's going to be Sobers. His career average at number 3 was 72. And, as I said, he's, in my opinion, he's easily the second best batsman ever. Arj would agree with everything apart from the word easily. And then number 4 would be Kallis. He's the second best batsman of all the genuine all-rounders. So I would have Sobers at 3 and Kallis at 4. And I'll let Arj pick the pace bowlers.
I mean, yeah, going with Rav's logic, for me, it's. I want to pick my best bowlers for the lineup, the out and out best bowlers. So Richard Hadlee walks in for me. He's one of the bowlers. Imran Khan walks in, and my third selection for that would be Sean Pollock. So you probably have them batting. Imran would bat higher than the other two, and you'd probably go Imran, Pollock, Hadlee. So I'm guessing we go Imran 8, Pollock 9, Hadlee 10. And yeah, Rav, if you want to pick some of the slots.
Yeah, so that's Imran 8, Pollock 9, and Hadlee 10. I might want to mention that something about Pollock, I think we did earlier. By the end of 2003, having played a lot of test matches, I can't remember off the top of my head, close to 80 maybe, his batting average was almost 35, and his bowling average was a phenomenal 20 for Sean Pollock. And yeah, so he's a lot better batsman and a lot better bowler than what he ended up with as an overall number. Even those were still good enough. Anyway, moving on. So that leaves me with number 5, 6, and 7. I won't pick the batting order yet, but keeper Gilchrist walks in, no contest. 2 batting all-rounders or batsmen. I'm going to go with Keith Miller at number 5. Just a little bit of a detour with Keith Miller. Like I said earlier, he started at 18, his first-class cricket before the war in 1938 or something. Yeah, early 1938. And he made 181 as an 18-year-old in a first-class match. And then he played for 3 years, and then the war happened. And when he first played in the Victory Test in 1945, he's almost not quite 30, in his late 20s. He only had bowled 7 overs in his first-class career. He's almost, in his late 20s, he only delivered 7 overs in his first-class career, and he had 1 wicket before the war. And then 1945 Victory Test, someone flicked the ball to him, in the nets or something, and I was like, oh, this guy's quick. And then he suddenly became more of a bowling all-rounder, and in fact ended his career as Australia's best bowling average for someone with 150 plus test wickets as a pace bowler. Since his retirement, only 2 players had a better average than him. That was Glenn McGrath and Alan Davidson. So imagine someone starting as a specialist batsman at 18. This is not, one of those funny selections like when they selected Steve Smith as a spinner. Despite him averaging 50 in first-class cricket with the bat, it was like desperation. So this is a proper specialist batsman becoming the 3rd best bowler in terms of averages for Australia. So yeah, Keith Miller was a very, very talented batsman, and so I'll pick him at number 5. And number 6, I might bat Gilchrist at 6, and my other batting all-rounder would be Ian Botham. I know his overall stats weren't that great, but he was technically correct batsman when he wanted to be. Although most of the highlights we probably see were him hitting over third man in Headingley and stuff. So I don't think I should pick Botham, but yeah, my 3 would be that. I think this is probably the one disagreement we would have. So mine would be Miller, Botham, Gilchrist for 5, 6, 7.
I mean, when you say disagreement, I would say Keith Miller for sure. No question about it. He walks in. Botham, was a phenomenal cricketer. as an all-rounder, but he really dropped off in the second half of his career. I mean, in the first 25 matches before he got made captain, he was an unbelievable all-rounder. He made 600s, averaged about 40. He took about 139 wickets, so basically something like 5.5 wickets per match at an average of 18. I mean, he was just, and also he was the ultimate kind of way that you imagined an all-rounder. You know, he would bat in your top six, aggressively score runs, and then was a strike bowler. And, you know, there's that famous match, Golden Jubilee match against India, the one-off match in 1980. Pretty much sums up Ian Botham at his peak, you know. Took 13 wickets, wickets in both innings. And then when England were in trouble at 58-5, he comes in and then hits 100. And off the field, he then enjoys himself even more with drinks every night. So, I mean, he was a kind of the stereotype of your ultimate all-rounder. And he was the one guy out of all of them that could do both at the same time. You know, he's the only one. He did 5 wickets and 100 runs in the same test 5 times. And I don't think anyone else even did that more than twice. So he had some phenomenal attributes, but he doesn't make my side. It's a tough one. You can't really, after saying all that, to leave him out, you can't. I don't think we need his bowling, given we have the other three guys, and then we've got so much bowling anyway. It's tough to compare eras, and you know, obviously, I didn't see some of the past players like Aubrey Faulkner was a fine all-rounder, early 1900s, and to sort of. He's potentially was a better batsman than both of them. So you could go with him for number 6 and bat Gilchrist at 7. It's a tough one. I mean, I think I'd probably edge towards Faulkner, but I can see the merits of both of them as well. So where are we? We've got...
so we left openers and a spinner, yeah.
All right, so maybe I'll cover the openers. So openers... for me, openers is an interesting one because there haven't been that many opening batsmen who are effective bowlers. And I think there are three real contenders for this. I would say Eddie Barlow, who was a fantastic player and didn't look the most talented, but was just always effective and had a very good attitude. And then and then there's Vinu Mankad and there's Trevor Goddard. Now, Eddie Barlow, I think I'm going to disqualify just because we're going to pick this team based on their test records. And Barlow, unfortunately, didn't get to play because he played some test matches, but he didn't probably get to take enough wickets because of the apartheid stopping South Africa. So Barlow, I think he took something like 40 wickets. So I think we should probably leave him out. But he showed his talents in the, when England played the rest of the world in 1971, he took a lot of wickets and at a low average. And he was a fine batsman as well. So, and he served Derbyshire even when he was past his prime at 36. He played pretty well for Derbyshire. So Barlow, it would be nice to have him in, but I think he's disqualified. So I'm going to go for that leaves Vinu Mankad and Trevor Goddard. Now Mankad is kind of there was that story where Sehwag famously asked who Vinu Mankad was, but he was an outstanding player at a time where India really were a weak side, and he was kind of, India's first ever test victory against England. He took 12 wickets, I believe, something like 12 wickets and 8 in innings. And then India's first series victory when they beat Pakistan 2-1, he took, I think, 13 wickets in one of the tests, 8 wickets in one innings in another, 8 wickets in another test. And he also... The next 2 Indian victories, so pretty much the first 5 victories India ever had in test matches, he was an influencer. So the next 2 against New Zealand, he got double centuries in both of them. So he averaged 40 as an opener, which is a lot better than his overall career numbers. So he, for me, comes in as an opener and a slow left-arm bowler. And the other opener is Trevor Goddard, who was part of that 1970 side that whitewashed or beat Australia 4-0. His numbers aren't that great. I mean, he only averaged 34 as an opener, but he was very technically correct, very good at seeing out the new ball, only made 100, but got quite a few 90s, and a very, very good left-arm bowler, one of the most economical. I think conceded about 1.5 runs and over, averaged about, I think, 26 or something. So, and offers more left-arm variety for the attack. Goddard, sadly, he decided in 1970 he was going to retire. He was quite old by then, and his batting had dropped off. And then he was kind of harshly left out of the final test. I'll pass over to Rav on the spinner selection.
Before I pick the spinner, I just want to say something. Maybe it's a controversial subject, shouldn't touch it, but about the Mankad things related to run out. But one thing I just wanted to mention is that when he first ran out Bill Brown in a tour match before the test that got, I don't know, in that game, it was against Australia 11, so it was pretty much an Australian team, although it wasn't a test match. Australia was set a target of 203 runs under 2 hours. Australia was set a target of 200 something, I can't remember, under 2 hours, 251, and 2.5 hours, sorry. And so Mankad ran Bill Brown out, and then Australia were none for 60 or something at the time. And a lot of people talk about that thing, but they forgot that Mankad took 8 for 84 in 2 hours against a, almost all-time great Australian team. It wasn't the full test team, but it was an Australian 11 team. And so he was a phenomenal spin bowler, I think. And just wonder, maybe we won't need his bowling here, but that 8 for 80 should be talked about a lot more than the run-out.
I think that should be a phenomenon like that, where you take a flurry of wickets when time is running out, should be called Mankaded rather than the stupid thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least he has a test named after him, the Lord's Test, where India were being demolished, and he took wickets. He took 5 wickets and made, I think, 180 in the second innings and 70 in the first innings. Phenomenal performance.
Yeah, we wrote an article about on Bill Brown's birthday about what a brilliant two gentlemen both of them are, and then you can check that out later. Anyway, so for my spinner, there's some tough competition with like the likes of Ashwin and Jadeja. Ashwin's wicket-taking skills are phenomenal, and but I'm biased towards wrist spinners, and I want a captain, like top quality captain who can manage these high-profile cricketers well. So I'm going to go with the great Richie Benaud. Like I said earlier, if you look at his overall stats, it might not stand out. But if you start looking at from the time when Keith Miller retired in Karachi, 1956, from that point onwards, from a bowler who was taking 2 wickets per test, Richie Benaud became a bowler that took 5 wickets per test and 6 wickets per test in away matches. Phenomenal rate of 5-wicket hauls in that period, every third or 3.5 innings. And he was a pretty useful batsman as well. He made 3 test hundreds, 2 of them in one series, very first series after Keith Miller retired. He lived, sort of played under Keith Miller's shadow, the larger-than-life fighter pilot, all-time great cricketer. But the first tour after the Asian swing in 1956, when they went to South Africa, Benaud made 300-plus runs at 55 and took 30 wickets at 22 or something. And in the history of cricket, there's only been 3 instances of a cricketer taking 30 wickets and scoring over 300 runs. Obviously, that favours bowling all-rounders, but still, that's phenomenal. Only 3 people ever managed that, other being Botham in 1981 and some George Giffen in 1894 or 5. Anyway, so I think Benaud is very good. And also, we were talking about Test cricket, but it's worth mentioning in a strong Australian competition, majority of it, Benaud made 20-odd hundreds in first-class cricket in 250 games. So that's almost like 1 every 11 matches. You don't do that without being a useful bat. So, yes, Benaud would be number 11. So if we sum up, we have agreements on 10. So Binu Mankad, Trevor Goddard, Sobers at 3, Callis at 4, Miller at 5. I would have both them. I think I would have Faulkner at 6, or we can switch around with Gilchrist. Kelly at 7, Imran at 8, Pollock at 9, Hadley at 10, Benaud at 11. I'll probably have Kapil Dev as the 12th man. He could come in for Benaud on a pace-friendly tracks, and he was a brilliant fielder and a brilliant team man from my recollection of things.
Excellent. That's a phenomenal team, and more importantly, a very brief biographical sketches of all those players, particularly for younger listeners. I think that would probably give them the incentive to go and read about these great cricketers and their great exploits. Before asking you guys to do this, I wanted to do it myself just to know that theoretically it's even possible, and the fact that you could still end up with a decent team. So I'm just going to match my team against yours. Most of the entries are the same, probably 3 differences. One, I've gone for Shakib at 5 instead of Keith Miller. I haven't gone for both them. I've gone for Imran Polak Hadley for sure. Instead, I've gone for Davidson because Davidson is a cricketer that I was personally fascinated by because I discovered him very late in life. There was no doubt in my mind that Wasim Akram is the greatest left-armer of all time. And this was like when I was very, very young. And I saw Alan Wilkins asking, but what about Davidson? And I thought, this guy's gone berserk. How can you even compare anybody with Wasim? And then I dug up his numbers and I read about him. And then there was also the documentary on the Tight Test, not the Tight Test per se, but the whole series of the 1960 series. And the way he talks about that series, oh God, he's such a sport. He's talking as if he was a fan rather than a participant in that. So I just found everything fascinating about his personality, and his numbers are damn good. His bowling average is so bloody impressive that it is almost impossible to even say that Wasim Akram is definitely better. So just purely for the fact that I discovered him late in life and ever since I've been fascinated with it, I'd probably pick Davidson there. And a parochial pick for the spinner, I'll go with Ashwin because he's from my city and he averages more than 5 wickets per test. That's exactly what I want from my main frontline bowler.
That's an excellent team. I mean, glad you mentioned Davidson because I'm arguably the biggest fan of Alan Davidson. I would have sneaked him in the team, but Aj sort of reminded me, well, this is about Test cricket. He hasn't got a Test 100. You can't pick him. So, I
vetoed him, unfortunately.
Fan. I just want to add one more thing. He was a phenomenal swing bowler. And other than Sydney Barnes, who played before the First World War, so in the last 105 years, no bowler with 150 Test wickets had a better bowling average than Davidson when he took the new ball. Not even Malcolm Marshall. There are only 2 players who average less than 21 in fact. Davidson 19.25 and Malcolm Marshall 19.7. And then you have Ambrose, McGrath, Truman, Imran averaging around 21, 22. So he was an amazing new ball bowler. And then he could ball spin as well, like he did in the subcontinent. So it's a great pick. And Ashwin, it could be anyone. Like Ashwin, his wicket-taking skill, phenomenal. And like I said, that's a great team. I'm thinking if this 11 plays against the rest of the world, I think they would give them a run for their money. I mean, you got Sobers, you got Imran, Pollock, Hadley, Gilchrist.
I guess opening batsmen we may be slightly weaker than alternatives.
Yeah, that's only weakness, right? Yeah.
I think only
they're not bad. They're good
opening
players.
batting and number 5, 6 maybe.
Yeah.
But the rest of it, the number 7 onwards and number 3 and 4, you can't really argue against it.
Okay, excellent. I think I had fun picking the 11 and also having this whole discussion. Thanks a lot for joining, guys. And I've been fascinated by some of the numbers that you've thrown up on your Twitter handle and some of the numbers that you've shared here as well. I will certainly add their index and particularly the top 10 that they've discussed here to the show notes. And I'll also add other numbers that they've brought about throughout this in the form of an Excel or an image. Thanks a lot, Rav, and thanks a lot, Aj, for joining us. Looking forward to doing more such episodes with you in future.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. The Test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for 2. India at home. Lords goes wild.